right. All right, First Chronicles is our topic today. First Chronicles. I was reminded recently I'm endeavoring to read through the Bible this year, and I got started there in January, and I've kept up with it. In fact, I'm a little bit ahead, which is always a scary thing, because then you start to say, well, I can take a day or two off, and next thing you know, you're behind. But it hasn't been too long ago that I read through First and Second Chronicles in that journey, and it'd been a while since I'd probably been in those pages, and I'd forgot that that's one of those sections, especially in First Chronicles, that is kind of hard to slog through, because it's genealogy after genealogy, and those are some tough sections. We'll have a bit more to say about that before we're done. There is some value there, so don't just dismiss those out of hand. Let's take a look, first of all, at First and Second Chronicles as a unit. The books of First and Second Chronicles cover the same historical era as the books of First and Second Samuel and First and Second Kings. In fact, if you've ever read First and Second Chronicles, it sounds like you're reading the story over again, because it covers some of the same territory, but it does so, and I guess in the mind of God, and I don't have insight necessarily into the mind of God, but obviously if God included it in the writings that he wanted us to read, there's a reason for him to go over some of the same territory. And First and Second Chronicles covers that same history, the time of David, King David, and into the time of the divided kingdom. It does so from a different perspective. In some ways, it's just like the gospel accounts, right? Maybe you've wondered in your life, well, why do we need 4 stories of the life of Jesus, right? One ought to do it, right? Well, and if you've ever had somebody go through that with you or studied that yourself, you know that the benefit of having 4 accounts is that you see things from a different perspective. Those writers recorded different things for different purposes. Those Gospels were written for different groups of people. And that lends to a different, not that the story's any different, but it looks at things from a different perspective. I've seen it described. It's just like, if you've got 4 people on different corners of an intersection viewing the same accident, sometimes they'll tell, this guy on this corner will see something the lady over here didn't see. So maybe that helps you kind of put that in perspective there. But First and Second Chronicles are like that. The books of Samuel, First and Second Samuel, First and Second Kings, we've just covered those recently. They primarily focus on what we might call the political history of Israel and Judah, the people of God. Political in the sense of, the setting up of the kings and the leadership through those earthly leaders. Some good, mostly not so good in a lot of ways. Chronicles, on the other hand, looks at that same historical period, not from a political perspective, but from a religious perspective. The former books were written from a moral and prophetic point of view. Chronicles were penned from a spiritual and priestly point of view. The books of Chronicles center around King David and the temple. First Chronicles in particular, what we'll be focusing on today, bases its references on the life and reign of King David himself. The time frame, and I believe last week in 2 Kings we talked about the fall of even the southern kingdom. 2 Kings 18:17 records the northern kingdom fell to the Assyrians, and then as time went on, you trace that story out. Judah, the southern kingdom, fell into sin as well, and God's judgment through the Babylonians came upon them. King Nebuchadnezzar, you remember we talked about him. He's going to come up in the sermon again today, so you can hold on to that. But anyway, it was about 586 BC when Nebuchadnezzar and his armies came to Jerusalem for that 3rd time and destroyed the city due to, the foolishness of the Israelites in rebelling against all of that. those of Judah, rather. Anyway, so 2 Kings ends right around 586 in our timeline. The books of 1st and 2nd Chronicles were likely written, and I say it that way because, again, there's no date on the book. It would have been nice if God could have included that for us, but he didn't. But most scholars point to about 450 to 425 BC, after the return of the exiles from Babylon. That's when they surmised that 1st and 2nd Chronicles were written. All right, it's obviously after the history they're recording. And I meant to check this out before so I could say this with some degree of certainty, but I believe in the Hebrew Bible, the Old Testament put together by the Hebrew people, I want to say 1st and 2nd Chronicles are the last two books in order instead of Malachi. Peter's given me the yes signal, so go ahead.
He was called by name 150 years before.
Right.
Before he went up against the Babylonian kingdom.
Yeah, I want to say, yeah, and that.
I thought that was in.
The Medes and the Persians ultimately conquered Babylon in 539, I believe. Don't quote me on that, but I'm not sure. I know, and I can't remember where it's at. I think in the book of Isaiah. Right.
I remember typically 150 years before it happened.
And that's probably about right if you think about it. I'm trying to, and this is, yeah. This is part of the puzzle of trying to put things on timelines because, you know, even people with a lot more letters after their name mine still argue about some of this. But again, for the sake of our study this morning, again, it seems to these books were written. And I want to say the prophecy of Cyrus is in Isaiah. I could get my phone out and Google it, and we could maybe find out, but somebody will probably do that before we're done. Yeah, look up Cyrus if you would and see where that prophecy comes from for us. So we'll put the writing of these books, and again, I guess where we left off there, I think in the Hebrew Bible, 1st and 2nd Chronicles are the last books in order for that Bible instead of Malachi. Malachi would be about this same time frame. Most scholars would claim that the writer was probably Ezra. Ezra, who was one of those leaders of the captives who came back after Babylonian captivity. Remember, they went to captivity in 586, and then the prophecy was 70 years they would be in Babylon. I believe that's Jeremiah. So, and it was Cyrus who paved the way for that. He paid the bills, in fact, and said, you know, you go back and rebuild your city. Ezra was part of that, so a lot of people seem to think Ezra might. The book, again, doesn't say who wrote it, but we believe it to be inspired. 1st Chronicles focuses on Israel's history from Adam to David, really. In fact, you'll see right away in the book, maybe you read through it this week, I don't know, but it starts their genealogies clear back, and what they're doing here, the writer, whoever he was, is tracing basically David's lineage because he's who their this kingly line through which the Messiah would come. That's that religious influence. The book of Chronicles focuses on Israel's history from Adam to David, emphasizing God's covenant, the lineage of Judah, and the importance of temple worship. And all of those things would be important. And you can see perhaps why God inspired the writer to approach things as he did, because what were they doing when they came back from captivity? They came back to a pile of rubble, and they're starting over, aren't they? The temple has to be rebuilt, and proper worship of God has to be reestablished. Those things are lost over decades. And so this writer is helping the people kind of get those things back in mind, picking up the pieces, if you will, of their history and trying to carry on the work. The book begins with these extensive genealogies tracing the nation's origins and transitions to the reign of David, highlighting his military victories, his spiritual leadership, and preparations for the temple. Now there's a big difference between the story of David told in 1 Chronicles and the story told of David in places like the end of 1 Samuel and 2 Samuel. Not that either story is wrong, but the writers are focusing on different things. And the main difference is, if you read through 1 Chronicles, you don't read any of the bad stuff about the story of David, right? No mention of Bathsheba, no mention of Uriah and all of the problems David had. And again, it's not to say that those things didn't happen, but the purpose of this writer was to again reclaim that history of David. He's promoted as quite the leader of the golden age in 1 Chronicles, and that's what an oppressed people or a people picking up the pieces. You need to hear the good stories, don't you? Kind of go back and claim the heritage and rebuild the ruins that. Pardon? Yeah. They again and lineages were very important under the old covenant, right? The priests. There's a priestly emphasis here, and you had to be from the right tribe, and they're trying to reestablish all of that. And once the temple records were destroyed, that's hard to do. So, all right, let's see here. What did I leave off here? Highlighting again military victories, spiritual leadership, and preparations for the temple. Unlike 2 Samuel, which details David's failures, 1 Chronicles presents him as a model king devoted to God. It ends with David commissioning Solomon, his son, to build the temple, stressing that faithfulness to God ensures his blessing. And I find it interesting that, that's one thing David had tried to hammer home to Solomon, because he could look back in his own life and see the mistakes he made. That's right. So, Dad trying to set up the son for success. Unfortunately, in Solomon's case, it worked for a while, but not long term. All right. Let's do any thoughts before we look at a quick outline? Right. Yeah. Yeah, that's a great example from the Gospels. There is a difference between John and the first, or Matthew, Mark, and Luke, right? That's why Matthew, Mark, and Luke are referred to as the synoptic Gospels. Maybe you've heard that word. That's because they look at the story of Jesus from kind of the same way. John is approaching it differently. Yes, he picks stories from here and there, but John is more thematic, and kind of follows that line. So that's yeah. And again, it's not that they're telling different stories. They're just looking at it from different perspectives.
And just note the history and pointing out how God predicted, controlled the fall of Babylon. Cyrus went in and didn't have to fight
Yeah, people who've been, again, through 7 decades of captivity, and they come back to see their great city in ruins, they need to hear the pep talks. We've got to get back to what God wants here. All right, a quick outline of 1 Chronicles. Chapters 1 through 9 are where you hit all of those genealogies, and again, affirming the royal lineage to King David. Chapters 1 and 2 are the genealogy from Adam to David. Then chapter 3 is genealogies of the sons of David and Solomon. Chapters 4 through 8 are the genealogies of the 12 tribes of Israel. And then finally chapter 9 is the genealogies of the remnant and of Saul. So kind of jumps around a bit, but it's just name after name. Again, and going back and trying to establish those links to God's historical story. Then the rest of the book, chapters 10 through 29, again recount the reign of King David. In chapter 10, you read once again of the story of the death of King Saul. That was recorded at the end of 1st or 2nd Samuel, earlier. In chapters 11 and 12, David, after the death of Saul, becomes king and conquers Jerusalem. Chapters 13 through 17, you've got the recovery and reinstatement of the Ark of God. First Chronicles kind of has an extended history of that. You read about that in 2nd Samuel, but maybe not as much detail here. And again, the idea here is First Chronicles is centering on reestablishing the worship of the true God, and the Ark plays, under the Old Covenant, plays a central role in all of that. Chapters 18 through 20 records many of the great victories of the mighty King David. Nobody could stand in David's way, and of course that was because God was helping him with all of that. Chapters 21 through 27 begin the preparations of Israel to build the temple. David wanted to do it, but God says, no, you've got too much blood on your hands, so your son will do it. But David went out of his way to stockpile supplies for that project, right? He was going to make sure Solomon had everything he needed to build this magnificent edifice. And then chapters 28 and 29, right at the end of 1 Chronicles, you've got the final days of King David and the anointing of Solomon as king. So, again, when you read through the story here, it's not because it's not a contradiction. Over and over again, the internet atheists try to point out, oh, this doesn't match, this doesn't match. Just think critically about those claims that are made. And sometimes what may appear to, well, are these people telling the same story? Yes, they are. They're just looking at it differently, choosing different parts for their purposes, and that doesn't make it untrue at all. So bear that in mind. All right, I've got a little longer theme here than I try to whittle it down, my choice, to just a word or a few words, but kind of hard to wrap First Chronicles up in that tight of a bow. But I've just said the theme is the centrality of the authority and worship of God. That's again what needs to be reestablished after the return of the exile. So that's what the book is, kind of the theme, what it's heading for. And here's how, from the ESV study resources, here's a paragraph I think summarizes it pretty well. It says, Judah and Benjamin, the only surviving tribes of Israel, had returned to the land from the Babylonian exile. They had rebuilt, or were in the process of rebuilding the temple in Jerusalem, but in many ways it seemed like they were still in exile. In fact, you can read in the book of Ezra, indeed, if Ezra was the writer of these at the inspiration of God, if you read Ezra, and we'll get to that before too long in our study, they had some trouble along the way here of reestablishing all of this, the building of the temple. Some roadblocks stood in the way. There were questions about Israel's place in God's purposes and the meaning of his ancient promises to David. With such questions in mind, the chronicler, it's just a name for the writer, wrote his books to promote spiritual and social renewal. He presented an interpretation of Israel's past, drawing mainly on the books of history, of Samuel and Kings. He showed how the nation's unfaithfulness to God had led to disaster, but also how its faithful kings and people experienced God's blessing. And again, I think that puts it pretty succinctly to exactly what's going on here. All right, let's focus in the last 10 minutes or so on some lessons from the book of First Chronicles. Let's talk about those genealogies, and I would just encourage you not to skip them, right? It's easy to jump over them. It's hard to pronounce those names. Don't worry about that. You don't have to know how to pronounce them. But here's some reasons why we shouldn't skip the genealogies. First of all, they help us ascertain and understand Bible chronology. And that's just kind of a basic thing, right? So-and-so begat so-and-so, and you've got the line of succession. Genealogies reveal God's plan working through human beings to achieve His purposes. Focus on that when you're kind of slogging through those passages. Really, it's just evidence that God is carrying on person after person. Yeah, there's going to be some more people that are going to have more said about them, right? There's a lot of breaks between Abraham and King David. Those were two mighty men of God in a lot of ways, and they take up a lot of Bible history, but all those steps between Abraham and King David, those people were important in the story, right? They don't need to get tossed to the side. Another part of this is to genealogies help us to know that God really knows each of us by name, not us in particular, but why record those names? Who knows what role they play? All we know about them maybe is a name, but they were important. We're not merely statistics or numbers on a computer printout. I think the same thing holds true today, right? You may view yourself, well, I'm not a very bright light in God's story, right? I don't seem to be making much of a difference. Who knows what difference? Maybe your name, maybe my name will just be one of those people to get from this well-known person to that well-known person, but you're part of the story, aren't you? Right? That's important. God uses people who may not be as well-known as others. These names aren't included just for filler, so we can have a certain sized book, I guess we could say it that way. That's one lesson. Raise your hand as I go through these, if you got something to say about them. Number 2, find ways to honor the sacrifice of others. In 1 Chronicles chapter 11, there's a story there that kind of stands out. 1 Chronicles 11, verses 17 through 19. Here David again is following the death of Saul, is made king over all of Israel. 1 Chronicles 11, 17 and 18. David's in the midst of wars, pushing back the troublemakers. It says, David had a craving and said, "Oh, that someone would give me water to drink from the well of Bethlehem, which is by the gate." And that might have been on David's part. He's got time to pause in all the battles. Says, "I just wish I had a drink." And that was great water. Well, it says, so 3 of David's mighty warriors broke through the camp of the Philistines and drew water from the well of Bethlehem, which was by the gate, and took it and brought it to David. Right? What a gift. What did David do, though? Poured it out. And you might say, what a horrific thing to do for what it cost these men to do it. They took their life in their hands. The rest of verse 18 says, "Nevertheless, David would not drink it, but poured it out to the Lord. And he said, Far be it from me before my God that I should do this. Shall I drink the blood of these men who went at the risk of their lives? For at the risk of their lives they brought it. Therefore he would not drink it. These things the 3 mighty men did." And again, maybe this is more of a Hebrew way of thinking, but that was the greater honor for David to do in this case, to show what it meant there. So again, find ways to honor the sacrifice of others. Be mindful of what maybe someone else has done by way of sacrifice to help you out in your life, and find ways to honor those things. That's a great lesson. Number 3, the book of 1 Chronicles also dramatically underscores the importance of the ark and what it symbolizes. In chapter 13 and verse 11, you've got David's bringing the ark of God to Jerusalem, and there's some trouble that comes with that. You've got, I think this is the, let's see, get to where I can read it here. Yes, verse 9 of chapter 13. When they came to the threshing floor of Chidon, Uzzah put out his hand to hold the ark because the oxen nearly upset it. The anger of the Lord burned against Uzzah, so that he struck him down, and he put out his hand to the ark, and he died there before the Lord. Then David became angry because of the Lord's outburst, and he called the place Perez Uzzah to the day. So again, and David probably responded like probably most of us would. Why do that? It was something that Uzzah did to try to prevent the ark from falling, but what had God been clear about? How to handle the ark. And I guess we could argue with God about that, but God was serious about the role the ark played in the worship to him, and you weren't to touch that thing. Even if you think you need to in that situation, God puts an exclamation on that here. So, and that's part, I think, of what this writer is doing in just re-emphasizing and reestablishing the worship of God here. Then in chapter 15, in verse 2, verses 1 and 2, they stopped trying to move the ark for a while, and maybe David's wanting to let the dust settle from this event. It says, now David built houses for himself in the city of David, and he prepared a place for the ark of God and pitched a tent for it. Then David said, no one is to carry the ark of God but the Levites, for the Lord chose them to carry the ark of God and minister to him forever. And then it goes through the process of David redoing that, and again, it's a lot more careful. It seems like it at that time, so David himself learning that lesson. We also see in 1 Chronicles the importance of worshiping God with all your heart, soul, strength, and mind. Maybe you've thought that that's just a New Testament thing, right? No. This has always been what God's been involved with as far as desiring from his people. Also in chapter 15, verses 25 through 29, and I'm taking too long, I'm not going to get them all in here, but you've got a story there about David pouring out his heart to God. The ark finally arrives, and there's a lot of celebration. David honoring God with all of his heart, soul, strength, and mind. Let me go through the last 4 here pretty quick. The book teaches us also to avoid the sin of trusting in our own resources and not the resources of God. Chapter 21, verses 1 through 17. Chapter 21, verses 18 through 20, teaches us to not give God the leftovers. And we've talked about this before when we saw it probably in 2 Samuel, right? A sacrifice is meant to be costly. David, someone's going to give David the bull and the altar to sacrifice to God in thanksgiving, and David says, no, I need to pay for it. So we see that repeated. You see the passion of David to build the temple, and that's to his credit, and that's part of this story, but David wanted to see this done, and that was one of the ways David showed honor to God. Maybe, I don't know what was going through his mind, but maybe David's passion in doing this is a product of those times, maybe when he reflected back on his life and said, you know what, I was a mess there for a stretch, but God showed me mercy. David's thankful for that. And then finally, we see that God is bigger than our past. This might be the biggest lesson of all in 1 Chronicles. We see it in time for the people of Judah, what's left of the people of Judah, that it would have been easy when you go back to Jerusalem and see the mess just to think what? Well, God's done with us. Right? What reason would we have to expect God's even interested in us anymore? Maybe God can't straighten this out. However we try to rationalize those things, the story here is perhaps meant to teach us that God is bigger than our past. Judah had made a lot of mistakes, but they served a big God. God was able to take even their mistakes. They had to redo some things, reorient some things, but God, if you will, they get back on the path, and that's what we're working for in this story of God as well. When you hit hard times in your own life, remember this lesson. God's bigger than the mistakes you make. That gives me hope, right? Amen. All right, thank you so much. Take some time to look through at least. Maybe read through, if you can, 2 Chronicles. And we'll consider that, Lord willing, next Lord's Day.